Good morning. I am Molly Brinkerhoff, today's worship associate. Welcome to this September morning. We gather to worship, our hearts alive with hope that here we will be truly seen, that here we will be welcomed into the garden of this community, where the simple and the elegant, the fluted and the frilled, the shy and the dramatic complement one another and are treasured. May we know that here each contributes in their own way to the beauty of the whole. Come, let us worship together all genders, sexualities, politics, clappers and non-clappers, progressive and conservative. May we root ourselves in the values of this faith, compassion and courage, transcendence, justice, and transformation. We do have a few weekly announcements today. The first is if you are able to, please sign in on the chat box. That lets us know who is joining us. We will be having joys, sorrows, and concerns today. And if you haven't already emailed them to us, please post them in the chat box so we can be sure to light a candle for you. And please indicate it if it is a sorrow, a concern, or a joy. Reverend Kevin's installation ceremony, we hope, is going to be coming up soon so that we can have an official welcome ceremony. And hopefully it's in sometime in October, we will have this installation. And we are hoping that people will help out. So if you are interested in helping with this event, contact Lisa Christensen or Elizabeth Cogliati. Another is our annual fundraiser and dinner. We have some wonderful and generous donations for our fundraiser, and we're still looking for more donations and sponsors. So please contact Cindy Logan if you would like to help organize this event, or if you have items, services, or experiences that you would like to offer for bidding at the fundraiser. And I'd like to emphasize that it doesn't have to be an item. It can be a service, something that you can do to help someone else. And if you do have an item, though, we do have space in the building. Just let Cindy know and we'll arrange to collect it. Also, if you donate to KISU, National Public Radio, did you know that there is a way to double the impact of that donation? Simply let ISU know that when you make your donation, that you would like it to be credited to the Unitarian Universalist Church in Idaho Falls. And then this will help us have advertisement on NPR. And it's a great way to help us and them. And while we're no longer having an offertory time during the service, it is still important nonetheless. We are still a functioning church, albeit virtually. So we would gratefully receive any donations to support us. Just go to our website to click on the Give button, and we thank you for your support. And then there's one more announcement from Reverend Kevin.
We had hoped to resume in-person services next Sunday, September 12th. But after assessing the current state of the COVID pandemic in our community, we have decided the risk is still too great. We will continue offering online services only through the month of September, and we will continue to reassess for possible reopening in October. This decision is based on several factors, including Bonneville County and surrounding counties remain in the red high-risk category for community transmission, according to the CDC. And this is largely due to the prevalence of the highly transmissible Delta variant that now dominates cases throughout America, and the significant percentage of unvaccinated adults in Idaho. The number of breakthrough infections among the vaccinated and the high rates of transmission of the Delta variant by vaccinated people continues to rise. There's hope that booster shots for the vaccinated will help this situation, but it will be at least a few months before booster shots are available to all adults. Children under 12 are still not eligible for vaccinations, and the number of pediatric cases and hospitalizations has continued to rise significantly in recent weeks. And if you saw Governor Brad Little's address last week, the situation in Idaho is deteriorating. with many hospitals nearing ICU capacity. All of us are anxious to meet in person again, and we must remain hopeful that we will be able to do so soon. In the meantime, we need to do everything we can to keep each other and our family and friends safe. Being together in community is important too, and we are discussing the possibility of an outdoor picnic or something similar in coming weeks. In the meantime, please stay safe and encourage everyone you know to get vaccinated and to wear masks where appropriate.
We will now move into the sacred time of worship. So we're going to work on the flower breath. Imagine smelling a flower. Breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth, as though to move the flower softly in the wind. Think of your breath as I ring the peace bowl 3 times. We will now begin our service with our prelude. Our church covenant was decided upon by a group of members from this congregation. Our covenant, along with our 7 Unitarian Universalist principles, is our guide to how our congregation will relate to each other and the world. Even though we cannot be together physically at the moment, I believe it is still important that we read our covenant together. As I read our church covenant for us all, please recite it from home with me. Love is the spirit of this community, and service its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. We will now be lighting our chalice. If you have a candle or chalice available, please light yours with us. And our chalice lighting today is coming from Eric Williams and is called There is Light. In the beginning there was light, infinite and expansive, flowing out from an unseen center. Throughout creation there is light, from the steady sun, the glowing moon, the flashing meteor, the twinkling stars, and the auroras dancing in the northern skies. Within each part of creation there is light, slowed down and held close by every cell and molecule, by each atom and element. Within you there is light, the same light as the source, the same radiance that is in all creatures. May this small flame be a constant reminder to you of your true nature and your kinship to all beings.
Good morning. Our call to worship this morning comes from Walden by Henry David Thoreau. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. I did not wish to live what was not life. Living is so dear. Nor did I wish to practice resignation unless it was quite necessary. I wanted to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life, to live so sturdily and Spartan-like as to put to rout all that life was not, to cut a broad swath and shave close, to drive life into a corner and reduce it to its lowest terms. I invite you to join in our opening hymn this morning, number 44, We Sing of Golden Mornings.
We sing of golden mornings, we sing of sparkling seas, of prairies, valleys, mountains, and stately forest trees. We sing of flashing sunshine and life-bestowing rain, of birds among the branches and springtime come again. We sing the heart courageous, the youthful eager mind. We sing of hopes undaunted, of friendly ways and kind. We sing of roses waiting beneath the deep piled snows. We sing the earth's great splendor, whose beauty round us glows.
Hello, my name is Davette Bogart, and I am presenting Time for All Ages today. I will be reading one of 4 books written by D.B. Johnson. He read Walden by Henry David Thoreau and was fascinated by the way it mixed nature and politics. Each of Mr. Johnson's books is developed from one of his favorite quotes from Henry David Thoreau. Today I'm going to read the book Henry Works. At the end of each of his stories, he has a little blurb that tells about, it's backwards. Anyway, that tells about the story. This is a true story about Henry's work. It's about the real life of Henry David Thoreau. He lived in Concord, Massachusetts more than 150 years ago. Back then, only a few people went to college, and they usually became preachers, teachers, doctors, or lawyers. After Henry went to Harvard, he didn't want to do any of those jobs. He tried teaching, but he didn't like punishing the students. He tried working on his father's pencil factory, and even though he invented a better pencil, he was not interested in the business. He wanted to go to the woods. He wanted to learn the names of birds by their songs and animals by their tracks. He would learn when each flower bloomed. Henry wanted to know the woods as well as a fox or a bird. Henry wanted to write it all down. Nature, he thought, would teach him how to live a better life. His friend Ralph Waldo Emerson was writing a book about this very thing. So Emerson helped Henry become a writer by introducing him to other writers and telling him to write every day. He was free to write all winter in his little cabin, and most every summer. He worked at jobs just 6 weeks each year. He fixed people's houses and measured their land, and in this way he had enough money to grow his own food and keep his clothes patched. No one could understand why Henry wanted to waste his life walking in the woods. So this book is about why. Henry Works. It's a misty, mizzly morning. Henry steps out of the door and sniffs the air. It's a perfect day to walk to work. Henry's a bear. Henry stops beside the pond to dig comfrey root. Channing walks by. Henry, he says, you're not doing anything today. Why don't you come fishing with me? Not today, says Henry. I'm walking to work. Henry puts the comfrey root in his hat and walks down the path. From the top of the hill, Henry sees clouds far away. It has been a dry summer, but he knows it will rain today. The rain will not come until afternoon, so Henry fills up his cap with water and sprinkles it on the milkweed flowers, the wildflowers. Hosmer meets him on the path. Are you being a rain cloud today, Henry? He asks. I'm walking to work, said Henry. At the brook, Henry cuts a pole from a pine branch. With it, he pushes 3 crossing stones into place. He puts the pine needles in his hat and with the comfrey root. He's making a path across the river. Henry tramps a trail across Hosmer's field and finds a fox's den. Mrs. Hosmer is sitting at her front window. Henry calls to her, keep your chickens inside. Tonight, there's a fox around. He leaves a branch of sweet-smelling pine on her window ledge. In town, Henry meets the postmaster. Henry says, I can't walk on my sore foot. Since we are not working, can you take this letter to Emerson? I'm walking to work right now, said Henry, but I'll take it to him on my way. Then he gave the postmaster the comfrey root because it would help his foot feel better. Henry finds Emerson in his garden and gives him the letter. The woodchucks are eating everything in my garden, Henry. I can take care of the woodchucks, he said. And he played his flute, and the woodchucks came to him. He tucked one in each pocket and walks off through the woods. In Alcott's field, where Henry sets the woodchucks free, he finds a patch of wild strawberries. He digs up some of the plants and puts them in his hat. Mrs. Alcott is hanging shirts to dry, and he warns her, you better take those shirts down soon. It's going to rain in an hour. Henry walks along the road to Hawthorne's house. Inside the fence, the garden is growing wild with grapes and raspberries. Henry takes the strawberry plants out, of his hat and finds a perfect place for them in the garden. It starts to rain. Henry walks to the mill brook, measuring the shallow water as he goes. Soon he meets old Flint sitting on the bank. "Are you taking a bath, Henry?" See, he's trying to check the water level. "No, I'm just walking to work." Henry climbs out of the brook and into the middle of a big huckleberry bush. He crawls under it and cuts away all the tangles and picks the berries until his pockets are full. Henry marks a path from the road to the huckleberry plant. As Henry walks down the path to his cabin, he meets Channing, carrying his fishing pole. He shows Henry the fish he has caught. "Did you go to work, Henry?" "I'm just getting to work now," says Henry. "What is your work?" Channing asked. "It's writing. I'm writing a book." Henry turns toward his cabin. All day he has taken care of things in the woods and things in town. Now he's back where he started. Inside he lights a fire and hangs his hat and coat on a rack. Then Henry sits down at the desk to begin his book. "Today," he writes, "I took a walk in the woods." The end.
Ours is a welcoming community where we find connection, a spiritual community where we find meaning. Ours is a sharing community where our joys are amplified, a caring community where our sorrows are lessened. We take this moment to reflect on our joys and concerns and acknowledge the mutual support of our community. I will now read the joys and concerns and sorrows we received, and Reverend Kevin will light a candle for each. Devette Bogart has sent us one sorrow and two joys. Her sorrow is for the recent passing of her cousin Bobby after a 14-month battle with a rare leukemia. The bright side is he has been released from the pain and left being loved by all who met him. He was a true example of the best of humanity. Her joy is that after almost 6 weeks in Promontory Point, after a fall, her mom, Joyce Chambers, has improved and may be coming home next week. We hope for that too. She says they are committed to making a trip to New York in November. And in August, she turned 89. So happy birthday, Joyce. She also wishes to express her gratitude for the care team and their attention and flowers to her mom. It was a real joy that this congregation reaches out as they do, especially throughout this pandemic. I have a joy that my son William is now married to the sweet and beautiful Nicole. It was quite a challenge since they got married in the Lake Tahoe area with all the fires. They worked through every challenge with coolness and speed. I think it'll be a good testament to their future. They weren't letting anything stop this wedding, and thankfully it turned out wonderfully. And I have two concerns from Reverend Kevin. Oh, yeah, and then I have one more from Anita. A concern for the future of women's reproductive rights in America, and especially for the women of Texas, in the wake of the recent terrible decision by the Supreme Court. A concern for the diversity of life on Earth. A new study indicates that 30% of all tree species face the threat of early extinction due to climate change, deforestation, and other factors. And then we have one more sorrow or concern from Anita Carpenter for her sister-in-law Mary, who fell on the rocks at the beach and broke both wrists. I had a friend that happened to, and it's a challenge, so we wish her well. And for all those who have not let us know of a concern, joy, or sorrow, may we remember those who have spoken, those they have named, and those we hold in silence in our hearts.
Our reading this morning is from the book Conflagration: How the Transcendentalists Sparked the American Struggle for Racial, Gender, and Social Justice by John A. Burns. To a degree often overlooked, Transcendentalism was a movement almost entirely within the congregational churches of the Boston area that had become Unitarian. It was a spiritual and moral renewal movement among ministers and lay people in those churches. It is also almost impossible for many readers in our secular culture to realize how influential churches were in mid-19th century America, especially in Boston, the epicenter of its dominant religious culture. Although historian Sidney E. Mead once wisely called us the nation with the soul of a church. The Transcendentalist movement called forth efforts to make liberal religion more genuinely democratic and more effective in bringing about the many reforms needed to make society more democratic as well. As John Behrens notes in the beginning of his book Conflagration, most Americans probably encounter the term Transcendentalism for the first time in some high school or college English class when reading Thoreau's Walden or perhaps one of Emerson's famous essays like Nature or Self-Reliance. For me, it was my sophomore year in prep school, and now decades later, I still have my well-worn paperback copy of Walden from that class. Unfortunately, this means that Transcendentalism is mostly viewed as a literary movement. This centered in New England that reflected the romanticism and nature interests of many mid-19th century American intellectuals. And in fairness, this is certainly part of the story. After all, notable Transcendentalists like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Margaret Fuller, and Louisa May Alcott are some of the greatest figures in American literature from the period. And a visit to the so-called Authors Row in Boston's Mount Auburn Cemetery, or Authors Ridge in Concord's Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, attests to the prominence of New England, and especially the Boston area, in the Transcendentalist movement. But Transcendentalism was much more than a literary movement. At its heart, it was a progressive social, philosophical, and spiritual movement that believed in the value of individuals who could transform the world into a more egalitarian and humane place. And as our reading this morning described, it is important to understand the importance of the religious aspect of dimension of Transcendentalism in New England to get the full picture. As a religious movement, Transcendentalism represented a trend toward intuitive understanding and away from a strictly rational, empirical worldview. In the history of Unitarian Universalist faith, it was one of those periods which highlights the old debate between a heart versus head approach to religion. Unitarians in the first half of the 19th century still identified as Christian, but they often simply rejected the supernaturalism attributed to biblical miracles, or they spent a substantial effort trying to explain such stories with plausible scientific alternatives. At its worst, sermons from such a perspective presented a very dry and uninspiring spirituality that Emerson famously derided as being corpse cold. For the Transcendentalist, the direct experience of spiritual feelings was more important than the words of ancient scripture or the trappings of tradition. They sought to understand the presence of the divine in nature and saw the sacred revealed in the hearts and souls of all of humankind. It is no wonder that poetry and essays about the nurture of the soul and the wonders of nature would become the vehicles to express such a spiritual movement. Nor is it surprising that Transcendentalists would be inspired to take up so many social justice causes to incarnate their faith in the world. Any list of prominent Transcendentalists would include famous Unitarian clergy like Theodore Parker, Thomas Starr King, James Freeman Clark, and even Ralph Waldo Emerson, who had a brief career in ministry before deciding it was not his true calling. It would also include a long list of other Unitarian clergy, such as Henry Whitney Bellows, Charles Follen, and Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who, though not as well known today, were important and locally famous in their time. And when you look at the relationships between these Unitarian ministers and others within the Transcendentalist circles, it is a network of friends and colleagues that extended to a remarkable who's who list of the movers and shakers that transformed American society in many arenas in the decades before, during, and after the Civil War. And it was often the congregants of churches served by Transcendentalist ministers who became key figures in a variety of reform movements. William Ellery Channing, for example, who makes any short list of famous Unitarian ministers, was a mentor to many people, including Dorothea Dix, the famous advocate for reforming the care of the mentally ill, and Horace Mann, who was a champion for public education. Transcendentalists made an oversized contribution on about any issue you can name, and sometimes a single person made a significant impact on multiple issues at different points in their life. If you really want to learn their stories, I highly recommend reading John Bieran's book or the book The American Transcendentalist Essential Writings by Lawrence Buell. But this morning, I want to share the brief story of two lesser-known people to illustrate my point. So let me start with Thomas Wentworth Higginson. Higginson, who lived between 1823 and 1911, was a precocious young Transcendentalist who entered Harvard at the age of 13 and later graduated from Harvard Divinity School in 1847. Even before beginning his ministry, he was a staunch abolitionist, and like many other Unitarians, he opposed the U.S. war with Mexico, seeing it as an effort to expand the reach of slavery. In his first settled ministry in Newburyport, Massachusetts, he became aware of the low wages and miserable conditions suffered by female factory workers in the New England textile industry. And so he became a champion for their cause. Unfortunately for Higginson, such radical, progressive views and local notoriety did not sit well with the leaders of his congregation, and he was shortly dismissed. To earn a living before his next called ministry in 1852 at the Free Church in Worcester, Massachusetts, he began to write extensively and lecture on social justice and nature. During this period, he became increasingly radicalized on the issue of slavery, especially in the aftermath of the Fugitive Slave Act, which was passed in 1850. It wasn't long before he became an ardent supporter of John Brown, and he eventually joined with Theodore Parker and 4 others as part of the so-called Secret Six, who financially backed Brown's failed attempt to foment a slave insurrection in 1854 with his famous raid on Harper's Ferry. Unlike the other 5 conspirators who fled the country after John Brown's capture, fearing for their freedom and even their lives, Higginson remained in America and kept a low profile for a brief time. Around this time, he also resigned as minister of the Free Church to focus on his writing and his advocacy for abolition and women's rights. After reading some of his work in The Atlantic, Emily Dickinson wrote to him for feedback on some of her poems, and he remained her literary friend and editor until her death. When the Civil War erupted, Higginson volunteered to serve in the Union Army and was given command of the 1st Black Regiment of Freed Slaves, the 1st South Carolina Volunteers, in 1862. After being injured in 1863, he resigned his commission and returned to New England, relocating to Newport, Rhode Island. There he continued his literary career and advocacy work, especially on behalf of the American Woman Suffrage Association. Though he never returned to ministry, he helped found the Free Religious Association in 1867 and often wrote about the universality of religious belief and natural religion, further contributing to the broadening of the liberal religion toward the Unitarian Universalist faith we see today. He also remained an advocate for social justice for the rest of his life. My second story is about Elizabeth Palmer Peabody, who lived between 1804 and 1894. Although she is best known for being an advocate for early childhood education, including bringing the German kindergarten movement to America, Peabody was also a wonderfully complex woman with connections to so many other important figures. In her 90 years, Peabody never married, nor does she appear to have been in a so-called Boston marriage like some other women of her day. But her 2 younger sisters were married to none other than Horace Mann and Nathaniel Hawthorne. As early as 1832, when she was 28, she and her sister Mary ran a small school during the day and taught evening classes for women. One of the residents of the boarding house where they lived on Boston's Beacon Hill was the Unitarian minister Jared Sparks. So it was common for guests like Emerson, James Freeman Clark, and Margaret Fuller to drop by, and Peabody soon became friends. She too attended Channing's church and became an ardent admirer and friend. As she once said, in the history of the so-called Transcendentalist movement in New England, I know of no name older than Dr. Channing's. Peabody was more pragmatic about her transcendentalism than many of her peers, and Buren suggests she was more a disciple of Channing than of Emerson in this respect, focusing on the humanitarianism of Jesus and in religion in general. Her advocacy for education and women was motivated by what she called the social principle in religion. Even so, she too contributed to the literary side of the movement, and in fact may have been the first American to use the term transcendental in one of her essays from 1826 about the spirit of the Hebrew Bible, published in the Unitarian journal, The Christian Examiner. As I think about her life and her circle of friends, I am envious. Can you imagine enjoying a social gathering in her Boston home with the likes of Peabody, Emerson, Hawthorne, and others? As a history buff, just fact-checking the details for this sermon reminded me of what an amazing period of history this was, and the incredible cross-pollination of ideas among New England Transcendentalists. And if you look at the generations of Unitarians and Universalists that followed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the influence of the Transcendentalists continued to inspire even more reformers and institutions like the ACLU that is still active today. I'm also struck by the professional, legal, and physical risks that these Transcendentalist reformers were willing to accept. Taking a radical position for the abolition of slavery, for example, seems admirable today, but is what we might call a career-limiting move for many ministers before the Civil War. Even Theodore Parker was ostracized by the fine Boston Unitarians despite drawing thousands to hear him preach. These days, when the Unitarian Universalists march in the streets for causes like Black Lives Matter, or when they block pipeline construction or clear cutting on behalf of the earth, there can still be risk involved, and we must each assess whether the risks are worth it. But if we need inspiration to do this prophetic work, we can look to a deep history of spiritual ancestors who transformed American society in their time. I also believe that Transcendentalism was the most important transformative movement in the history of Unitarian Universalism because it opened the door for broadening our acceptance of non-Christian religions and the humanism that has become so central to our faith. And if you too find spiritual inspiration in nature and value the direct experience of the sacred, you are a spiritual heir to Transcendentalism as well. So visit Walden Pond and read Thoreau and Emerson if you haven't already. But there is so much more to explore and appreciate from the legacy of the Transcendentalist movement. I invite you now to join in our closing hymn, number 126, Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing.
Come, thou fount of every blessing, tune our hearts to sing thy grace. Streams of mercy never ceasing, call for songs of loudest praise. While the hope of life's perfection fills our hearts with joy and love, teach us ever to be faithful. May we still thy goodness prove. Come, thou fount of every vision, lift our eyes to what may come. See the lion and the young lamb dwell together in thy home. Hear the cries of orphans silent, feel our love glow like the sun. When we all serve one another, then our heaven is begun. Come, thou fount of inspiration, turn our lives to higher ways. Lift our gloom and desperation, show the promise of this day. Help us bind ourselves in union, help our hands tell of our love. With thine aid, O fount of justice, earth be fair as heaven above.
Our closing words are from Ralph Waldo Emerson. We have a great deal more kindness than is ever spoken. The whole human family is bathed with an element of love like a fine ether. How many persons we meet in houses whom we scarcely speak to, whom we yet honor and who honor us. How many we see in the street or sit with in church whom, though silently, we warmly rejoice to be with. Read the language of these wandering eye-beams. The heart knoweth.
We will now extinguish our chalice with the following words. So please join me. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Please join us for our coffee hour, and that link should be on your email. So we'll see you after the postlude.